for tuning in today. So as Xander said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I did as part of my dissertation and just share the direction that this is going in now. So we'll get started here. So as Xander alluded to, pressing natural resource issues like fire, they don't sort of stop at the boundaries that we were talking about earlier, state lines, federal lines, private land. So these challenges are huge and they're boundary spanning, and we have to collaborate across agency and land tenure to address them. And a lot of research from natural resources has shown for a long time that trust is a critical ingredient to the successful collaboration. So there's sort of a wealth of social scientists in the natural resource field that have really demonstrated that trust really sort of greases the wheels of collaboration and makes landscape level collaborative management possible. And so this is relevant to fire research. But it's difficult, right? So building trust is difficult, and making it work in collaborative settings is difficult. And so the goal of this work was really to examine at the landscape level some forest management initiatives and to identify structures and practices within those initiatives that were enhancing trust and subsequently making the collaborative process work more smoothly. So we really wanted to understand what is it that makes trust and collaboration in landscape level management projects possible and work. So before I get into the study that we did, I want to take a little bit of time and define trust. And so you can think of it in two ways. Trust can either be thought of as a psychological state, or you can think of it as sort of the act of trusting. And so for the context of this work, we really wanted to think of it as the psychological state and not the action of trusting. And so then within that, we're defining trust as entity A, so it could be a person, an institution, believing that a second entity, which we're calling entity B, will do a given action. So that's that middle box right at the bottom, this trusting tripartite relationship. Before you get to that, there's a series of antecedents that might institute or initiate trust, right? So you have the antecedents leading to that tripartite relationship, and then as a result of that trust, you're going to have a response, which we're calling response D. And again, entities could be people, so that's probably, the thing that you think of the most. They could be institutions, so somebody might have trust in the Forest Service. They could be a process, so the example that I like to give here is that I might trust a mortgage application process, or maybe not. And then you can have trust in maps, objects, and an example of this would be a map, or maybe a model or something like that. For the purpose of this work, any entity B can be any of those entities, but entity A, we're really just looking at people.
Kim, this is Xander. Let me interrupt for just 1 second.
Sure.
If there's anything you can do on your end the sound is a little bit broken up, and I don't know if you're on a speakerphone, but it's a little choppy. So if there's something simple to adjust, please go ahead and try. Otherwise, it's clear enough that I think we can keep going.
Does this sound better to everybody?
Yeah, I think that is better.
Okay. Let's try it like this. Okay, so based on those antecedents that I was talking about, we delineated some different forms of trust. And to do this, we first went to the social psychology literature and read through looking for different forms of trust that had been documented there. And we then repeated this sort of in the business and management literature and the natural resource literature, and kind of created a typology of all of the different types of trust that sort of showed up. And then, kind of made categories like, okay, these folks are really all talking about the same thing, and these folks are talking about the same thing. And so based on that, we were able to parse out 4 forms of trust that are driven by their antecedents. So rational trust is based on this expectation that there will be a positive outcome. So this is largely past performance. You've worked with somebody in the past, they did great work, and you're anticipating that they're going to do great work in the future. Affinitive trust is based on social connection. So you have some shared experience with somebody, you know that you share values, perhaps you're members of the same social group, and you trust them based on the expectation that they're going to represent values similar to yours. General trust is somebody's sort of disposition in the world, so this one doesn't move. And then procedural trust is based on trust in a specific process. So if something is transparent, fair, and seems like it's going to benefit everybody equally, then you may have procedural trust in a process. And all of these exist across a continuum. So as you can see, affinitive trust, if you have no information about somebody, you might not have active distrust for them, but you would have a lack of trust. Similarly, if you have no information about somebody, you might not have rational active distrust for someone, but you might not have rational trust for them. And for each entity that you place trust in, you can sort of have this combination. So you might have affinitive trust for one individual because you know that they have values that are the same as yours, but active distrust from a rational standpoint in that same individual because they've let you down or performed poorly in the past. So there's sort of this mixing that can happen where you might have one type of distrust or one type of trust, or you might trust somebody to do one activity but not others. So this is getting, this is kind of getting messy and complicated. And so we wanted to look and see what types of these trusts, what type of trust comes about from what actions and which ones benefit folks engaged in collaboration. So just to get into this a little bit, to give you some examples, since that was a little confusing, rational trust, again, requires information and is based on the likelihood of positive outcomes. So if a forester has worked with a logger for a long time and sees that that logger follows prescriptions well, then the forester may have rational trust in the logger. Similarly, if a forester has knowledge that a logger really cares about stream quality because they're both members of Trial Unlimited, then the forester may have that affinitive social-based trust that I mentioned before. I'm just going to skip general trust because, as I alluded to, it doesn't move at all. So that is to say, it's not actionable. We can't change it. It's just how someone's disposition is in the world. And so we're really just going to skip over that one and focus on the ones that can be constructed or eroded through different processes or organizations within collaborative management. So the third one that we'll talk about, procedural trust. This is really trust in a process. So perhaps the NEPA process is a good example. Community member believes that their opinion will be considered because there's a process for considering objections or appeals in NEPA, or in this case on the slide I've used if a collaborative has a charter that outlines how decisions are going to get made or how folks are going to engage. So as I said before, it's kind of messy, right? You could have trust for a specific action but not. So I might, trust somebody to follow a timber harvest mark but not to show up to work on time. I might have rational trust but not procedural. And then this third bullet point, trust in an entity but not in another, and the idea of representation, it's possible that I may trust an individual but not the organization that they represent. So perhaps I've really gotten to know somebody very well and I think that they do great work, but the organization that they work for has let me down in the past or has done some things in the past that I disagree with, and I have a hard time with that. So there's, sort of this intricacy about where I place trust in and for what purpose. and then how does that impact how I show up in a collaborative and am willing to collaborate with folks. So we really wanted to look at how these different types of trust develop in the landscape initiative and the practices and behaviors that engender them. So specifically, I was interested in collaborative structures that facilitate the different types of trust. And then really, once those forms of trust have developed, which are most beneficial for accomplishing collaboration. Oops. Just going to go back here. Okay, so I'm just going to do a little bit of overview of the CFLRP, the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Project, in case some folks aren't familiar with it. As Xander said, you know, if you're involved in landscape fire management, probably you've heard of this program because they all address fire management. So the program started in 2009, and then the first year there were 10 projects funded. Then there was sort of a break in 2011, and then another 10 projects were funded in 2012. And then there were an additional 3 projects rolled in. So there are currently 23 projects funded across the country. I know this map is small and hard to see, but that's sort of the general layout of where the projects all are. They had to be over 50,000 acres in size in treatment area. And additionally, they had to be centered around national forest lands, but could additionally include adjacent lands. And they really needed to focus on restoration of fire-prone areas. They additionally had some other objectives around creating jobs, other socioeconomic objectives, but really restoration in fire-prone areas is sort of the meat and potatoes of the project. And they needed to be collaborative, so they needed to involve constituents and stakeholders across a wide range of sort of backgrounds and sectors. Now, within these projects, although they are made up of diverse stakeholder groups, the stakeholder groups are really making recommendations to the Forest Service. So it's important to remember that the Forest Service is never relinquishing decision-making. The collaborative is putting together recommendations, and those recommendations are going through the NEPA process, the same as recommendations would come from an individual or an organization in any other NEPA process. So just something to keep in mind, that when we're talking about reaching decisions and collaborating and reaching consensus, I'm not talking about the final decision on the ground. That is still made by the Forest Service. But so to really look at how structures and arrangements within these groups, and by that I mean the way that the collaboratives were working, sort of the rules and processes that they had in place, we wanted to try to select a range of formalized rules to informalized rules. And so we chose 4 collaboratives across the country, and I'm going to just refer to them with letters A through D instead of their names to protect the anonymity of some of the folks involved. But one, Collaborative A, was very highly formalized. They had an appointed facilitator who was sort of trained in conflict management and worked for a third-party facilitation organization. They had very formal rules for decision-making processes. They had established an executive committee. They had rules for membership. People had to sign a charter. They had meetings at regular intervals, and there were formal working groups. Sort of stepping down from that, the second collaborative, Collaborative B, was sort of highly informal. So there was an appointed monitoring coordinator who oversaw all of the monitoring activities, but everything else sort of happened on an ad hoc basis. The third collaborative, Collaborative C, was a little bit more formalized, but had some existing rules for an executive committee that really steered the collaborative and made decisions. But then the folks that were on the ground doing the work, there were no formalized rules for how they participated or how working groups were formed. So that collaborative really happened with rules sort of at the 10,000-foot level, and then sort of no rules or formalized processes on the ground. And then the final collaborative D, this collaborative had an appointed coordinator that was employed by the Forest Service, and that person sort of held regular meetings and called people to the table and helped people set directions, but how that happened was not delineated in a consistent or structured way. So we sort of selected a range of collaboratives that represented the range of formality that exists across the 23 in the country to really sort of look at, okay, does having these rules, does having structure, does having a facilitator make a difference in how trust comes about and subsequently supports collaboration. So to collect that data, we collaborated with colleagues at Florida State and interviewed folks in the first 10 CFLRPs. And then based on this, we were able to identify the collaboratives that we really wanted to dig into. We then, with the 4 that we chose, conducted 33 interviews and 6 site visits, and then we additionally collected a range of email correspondences from listservs, presentations that folks made at regional meetings, and we also collected governance documents from the collaboratives that had them. So this is just an example of a blog that one of the collaboratives used to just let everybody know what was happening and let participants know about meetings, and this is just one example of sort of a document that I would keep my eye on and routinely download and use for data collection. So we took all of these documents and notes from visits and interview transcripts and uploaded them into a qualitative analysis software called Hyper Research, and then conducted qualitative analysis on this. So went through an iterative process of looking for recurrent themes and patterns and linkages. We first went through looking for any patterns and themes, and then we went back through and applied that trust framework that I explained to you at the beginning to sort of see how that showed up. And the reason that we did it emergent first and then followed up with the framework that I had discussed is that we didn't want to miss anything because we were only looking for what fit in the framework. So by looking for emergent themes first and then applying the framework, and the second round of coding made sure that we weren't glazing over anything in service of making everything fit our framework. So as I said, we really focused on the actionable forms of trust, or rational, procedural, and affinitive, because those are the ones that could really move and be manipulated in service of collaboration. And we were able to find was a little bit about how trust and distrust form and how they function and what some of the limitations of that trust were. So where did it actually get people in terms of collaboration? So what we found was that affinitive trust was largely pre-existing, and it developed as individuals formed affinities within the collaborative as well. So there were some examples where people would be riding to sites in the car with each other, and they would get to talking on the way to going to a field site, and affinities would develop. We also saw that there were intentional facilitation techniques that were used, and I'll get into that in a little bit when I talk about the differences that facilitators and coordinators within the collaborative made in terms of trust development. But largely we found that affinitive trust was pre-existing. We found that rational trust was also pre-existing. In both of these cases, both affinitive and rational trust, folks had been working on these landscapes a long time together, and so they had these ideas in their head about each other. They had either working relationships with each other, or in some cases maybe were neighbors or had known each other outside of the forest management context. And largely the folks that had been working on the landscape for a long time together did have rational pre-existing relationships, either trust or distrust. And that applied to the Forest Service as well. So many folks had been working or interacting with the Forest Service on the landscape for many years prior to the creation of the CFLRP. And so they had, preformed opinions or trusting relationships with the Forest Service. But we also found that rational trust developed as individuals collaborated and sort of proved themselves. So the collaborative gave people the opportunity to come in and present their expertise and their opinions. And as individuals got to see other members doing this, they realized that those members were confident at their work, and they developed rational trust for them. Again, coordination and facilitation did assist in rational trust development, and I'll talk about that when I get to the difference between facilitators and coordinators. Finally, we found that procedural trust was very much supported by the creation of those protocols and rules that I discussed a little bit. In particular, collaboratives that had memorandums of agreement folks were really able to go and look at the relationship between organizations and who said that they were going to do what. That was really helpful for people feeling like transparent process was in place and that their sort of concerns were going to be addressed. Similarly, the collaboratives that had organizational charters that outlined how decision-making happened, who was in charge of sanctioning rule breakers, and that sort of thing was really helpful for helping participants to feel like the process was fair and transparent and that their concerns were going to be addressed. One big thing that we saw in one of the collaboratives was that collective input into the creation of the charter was heavily stressed as something that created trust in the charter or in the collaborative as an organization. And then enforcement, again, gets back to the coordinator and facilitator bullet point or topic, which I'll get to in a little bit. But in short, the ability for a collaborative to have somebody to enforce the rules that they had really emerged as something that made people feel like the procedures were going to work in their favor. So the facilitators and coordinators, this is something that emerged pretty early on in the process, and then we were able to then go back and talk to more folks about this and conduct some follow-up interviews. But we really found that facilitators and coordinators were really critical actors within these groups for engendering trust and supporting it both in unintentional and intentional ways. So both, I'll just talk a little bit about sort of the difference between them in terms of trust development and, first in terms of activities and then in terms of trust development. So facilitators and coordinators, you could use the terms interchangeably, but we're thinking about them as distinct. So both individuals might engage in scheduling and organizing meetings, sending agendas, taking meeting minutes, reminding people of assigned tasks and due dates, sort of these incremental task type of responsibilities. And in three of the cases, there were folks that took on these responsibilities. The facilitators would then sort of rise above that, so to speak. And I don't mean that in a negative sense that they're somehow better than coordinators, but just that they do additional work. And some of that involves conflict negotiation. So in one instance, one of the individuals really utilized interest-based negotiation as a formal conflict negotiation strategy and engaged people in really specific activities designed to bring people together and create trust. The facilitators also may engage in additional work around managing governance structure, establishing the ground rules and promoting democratic decision-making, creating processes for members to update the rules, and then, like I said, enforcing the rules and using sanctions against rule breakers to make sure that the rules really stand for something. They're not just lip service, but they're actually serving to protect members of the collaborative, particularly around the fear that the collaborative may be co-opted to serve sort of one user group's agenda over another. And so this happened only among the facilitators. The coordinators were engaged in those sort of incremental tasks that I showed on the previous slide, but then didn't really enter the realm of addressing conflict or managing governance. So now that I've talked a little bit about how we observe trust coming about, I want to sort of go over where the different types of trust showed up as important in the collaborative setting. And what we found was affinitive trust, which, as I mentioned, in many cases predated the collaborative and was pre-existing, was really critical for catalyzing collaboration. So in many of the cases that we looked at, the collaborative started in the first place because stakeholders, and sometimes in conflicting user groups or stakeholder groups, had an affinitive tie across those groups and were able to say, hey, is this working for you? Do you want to try to do it different? What if we apply for this CFLRP grant? In one instance, that actually took place after a congressional hearing that had gone poorly between two stakeholder groups. And although they were on sort of different sides of the argument, they had a personal affinitive connection between them and were able to get together and have a beer and talk about the possibility of applying for a CFLRP grant. And in many cases, after sharing this work, we've heard from sort of other collaborative groups that these affinitive ties that predate the collaborative have really been key for catalyzing the collaborative itself and sort of starting the conversation about the possibility of collaborating. Once that took place and the grant had been applied for and the collaborative got up and running, either procedural or rational trust was really necessary to recruit additional members. So people needed to either have rational trust, there was a likelihood of a positive outcome in their favor in order to join the collaborative, or they needed to know that there were strong procedures in place that were going to protect them and make sure that the collaborative wasn't co-opted for one user group's agenda. So they really needed to have a belief or trust that the process was going to be fair and run in their favor in order for them to join, which makes sense. Once the collaborative was up and running, procedural trust in some cases then created an environment for rational and affinitive trust to develop. So what this means is that folks that had been involved in historically contentious relationships with each other potentially would join a collaborative, in one case did join the collaborative, not because they trusted any of the other groups or people in the collaborative, but because the rules were strong and because there was somebody in place to make sure those rules were followed and to sanction rule breakers. So they joined the collaborative because there was procedural trust, but once they were there, they were able to interact with the other member groups and develop affinitive and rational trust. And in some cases, this was, affinitive and rational trust where there had previously been strong distrust. So the procedural trust in the collaborative really set the stage for other types of trust development. In instances where there was a lack of rational or procedural trust, many user groups became frustrated or disengaged. And in one case where there just wasn't outcomes produced, there was really strong rational distrust, and people began to question the utility of continuing to collaborate and participate in the group as a whole. Additionally, where there was a lack of strong procedural trust, because there were not rules to deal with things like personnel turnover, people became very concerned that if somebody, for example, rotated to another district, or if they lost their district ranger, that all of the trust stores that had built up really lived with that person, that they might have to start over again from scratch because there were no rules in place to sort of carry on that institutional knowledge and move the collaborative forward in the same direction that it had been moving in. One thing that we really found was that all three forms of trust were really necessary to have this shared understanding and willingness to consider new views. And so it's not so much that you can just have affinitive trust and that gets the collaborative up and running, but that you need to have all of these things in place in order to get people to a place where they're willing to consider other stakeholder viewpoints that may be opposed to their own, and where they can sort of come to see the other side of arguments that they may have historically not been willing to look at. However, we did also find some limitations of trust. And so in places where the trust was built and was strong, but as I said, there were no outcomes, people really were considering the utility of remaining in the collaborative. So in this case, this is from somebody who was really hoping, this quote is from somebody who was really hoping to see a substantial amount of timber coming off the project. And at the time that this individual said this to me, not a single piece of timber had made it to the mill that the individual was associated with. So really questioning, if we're not seeing results, you can develop all the trust in the world, but it doesn't make sense to continue to be involved if it's not benefiting us. Similarly, one of the big hopes was that if trust could be built between the Forest Service and some of the organizations that had been in historically litigious relationships with the Forest Service, that litigation may be avoided. However, when we talk to folks about participation in the collaborative and developing trust with the Forest Service, we did hear that although their hope is that they avoid litigation as well, categorically being involved in the collaborative and developing that trust doesn't mean that you don't litigate. And I think that we really heard loud and clear that the Forest Service continues to be aware of that, so that folks within the agency are very mindful of the fact that although they're developing this active trust in these relationships with individuals, that trust is tenuous and that a decision, a contentious decision could easily still be litigated despite these new relationships. And so just where we're going quickly in the future, and then we'll open it up to questions. I sort of alluded to this, but across all of the cases that we looked at, personnel turnover was really common. I'm sure that won't surprise any of you. But we sort of saw some really interesting ways that folks are starting to think about how they can deal with personnel turnover and the trust that's lost when folks leave. And so we're now turning our attention to what happens when those critical actors move on, and what are those interesting and unique strategies for dealing with it. And I'll just give you one quick example. In one of the cases we looked at, the agency staff member in charge of prescribed burning on that CFLRP was very aware that although they may hire someone who has a really robust background in prescribed burning and fire ecology, they might not necessarily have all the expertise and experience in dealing with a collaboration and all the personalities and backgrounds that come with such a collaboration. And so this individual petitioned the Forest Service to have her replacement hired a year in advance of her retirement, and that was approved. And that allowed her to bring this person on early and to introduce her to all the individuals that were working on the collaborative and all the different organizations, and really sort of introduce the new person to the process of being in charge of prescribed burning on a landscape that's part of the CFLRP process. So we're just, really starting to look at what are these interesting and creative ways that people are dealing with personnel turnover, and how is that impacting trust stores and as well as institutional knowledge. And we'll be looking at that going forward into the future. And just before we open it up to questions, I just want to thank the Pacific Northwest Research Station Focused Science Delivery Project for funding this work. All right, I think we have 15 minutes for questions. Is that right, Xander?
Yeah, I think you timed it perfectly. Thank you for a great presentation. It's really interesting, at least for me, to see some of my own experiences in some of these collaborative projects sort of reflected in a more, in an overview across projects. Let's see, we'll dive in here. Ray Travers asks, what rules are in place to prevent end runs to politicians, et cetera? So maybe you could talk a little bit, Kim, about some of the ways the rules were set up, and maybe because I'm moderator, I'll just abuse my privilege here and add in, maybe in addition to talking about this issue of sort of end runs to politicians, you can talk a little bit about the you mentioned this early on, the fact that the Forest Service sort of retains the decision-making ability?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So there's another act that comes into play, which some of you might be familiar with, which is the Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA. And essentially that it doesn't allow the decision to be considered outside the NEPA process, in my understanding of it. And so some collaboratives have really suffered from what some folks call FACA fear, in that you know, there have been really clear boundaries around how the collaborative's recommendation gets handled, and there has been some real nervousness that if the Forest Service participates in the collaborative, that might violate FACA. So there have many collaboratives, because of FACA, have really been very strict about making sure that the decisions that are put forth by the Forest Service are considered through the regular NEPA process. That said, many of the collaboratives do have members of the Forest Service that are participating, that are showing up, and that are giving presentations or being involved in the crafting of the decision that ultimately gets put forward in the NEPA process. And so while the collaborative recommendations have to be considered the same as any other comment during the public comment period, they're often going to be more robust, and they're going to be informed by current Forest Service thinking. And so if you sort of think of, like, if anybody is familiar with the NEPA triangle, all of this is happening all the way over to the left side of the triangle, this sort of thought and conversation with the Forest Service and all the other user groups is happening pre-decision. And so because that's happening, the decision and the conversations are informed by each other. So even though the Forest Service retains the ultimate decision-making, the collaboratives are having the chance to chat with them and give them their thoughts and go out in the field and walk around with them and sort of not necessarily influence their thinking, but put their 2 cents in well before the decision has been made. And it's happening in such robust ways. Decisions and recommendations are being made by collaboratives in such robust ways in many cases, that they're really solid recommendations that are making their way to the Forest Service. I think that it would be great to know a little bit more about what you mean by end runs to politicians. Do you mean sort of influence on the ultimate decision that's made by the Forest Service?
Yeah, let me go ahead and unmute the line so Ray can clarify a little bit.
Sure.
I'll just simply say that, like I'm in Canada, where over 90% in BC the land is public land, and what can happen is that the process runs its course, and then some powerful group, whether it's a private company or a union or maybe even a First Nation, can intervene, and that's the kind of thing that can and does happen.
Yeah, so this, I would say, wouldn't necessarily preclude that, and that's a little bit of what I was getting at with the idea that the trust development and the relationship development doesn't necessarily preclude litigation. So it's entirely possible that, as you say, the whole process could run its course. The Forest Service could make a decision that the collaborative is very happy with. The collaborative has given lots of input and recommendations in robust science-based ways. The Forest Service makes this decision that everybody's happy with, and then one user group, as you say, could indeed litigate and maybe not necessarily overturn the decision, but could certainly delay the implementation of the decision or possibly reverse it. So I think this doesn't sort of subvert NEPA. It all sort of is taking place before NEPA happens. And it's also possible that some of the groups that are participating in the collaborative may then turn around and litigate if a decision gets made that they strongly disagree with. That hasn't happened in any of the groups that we studied, but I think that it is certainly possible.
Great. Thank you, Kim.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see, so turning now to the idea of succession plans, Kim Kirkpatrick asks about making succession plans and letting all stakeholders know knowing about the succession plans makes an enormous difference in trust and success, as you said. So I guess that's more of a comment.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's really exciting about that is that the Forest Service, because they're a large agency and they're well-resourced, they may actually be in a great position to be able to do that, whereas smaller nonprofits that are sometimes involved in these may not be in such an awesome position to do that. But I think it's an exciting potential for the Forest Service.
And then Nick asked about the publication of your findings.
Yeah, so I just got the timely question. I just got reviews back on 2 of them this week, so we'll be revising and resubmitting. And then a 3rd publication is in review with Journal of Forestry. So we are hoping that Journal of Environmental Planning and Management and Society of Natural Resources will each have something out in the super near future, and then we're hoping that JOF will have something out in the slightly later future.
And we'll go ahead and I'll stay in touch with you, Kim, and when those do come out, I'll just email the folks who registered for this and share the links to those. So
great.
You'll hear about it, I guess.
Yeah.
Some of these slides I'd like to show.
Yeah, and okay, and so a member of one of the collaboratives is sitting here in the office with me and raised the idea of sharing the PowerPoint presentation, and so I'll work with Kim and figure out if there's a way we can do that.
Sure.
Let's see. So Chuck Henderson asked, or sort of states initially, that occasionally agreements arrive through the collaborative process gets vetoed by the national organization of some of the participants. So this,
yeah.
and I've certainly seen this where local folks for a big national organization are on board, they're in the discussions, but then, as it sort of works its way through the larger body to maybe say DC, suddenly there's a change in that organization's stance. And did you see any ways?
This is something that we noticed or picked up on, particularly with organizations that might have sort of a national stance on something. So one example would be, Sierra Club has a no-cut policy, but in several cases there would be individuals that were members of the collaborative that, would find some compromise with that. Similarly, there were members of even smaller organizations that were opposed to road. Their organizations had a stance opposed to the construction of new roads, but the members that were involved in the collaborative would compromise with that a little bit. And so I think that can be really tricky when those individuals bring that back to their home organization and the home organization doesn't support that. Those individuals really start to feel pulled on from multiple competing accountabilities. And people did tell us that they worried about the relationships that they developed within the collaborative, that if they, sort of made compromise in the collaborative and then couldn't act on that compromise that they had made or couldn't hold true to it, that would sort of endanger the relationships that they had formed. And so in some cases, people actually, even if they wanted to commit to a compromise, wouldn't if they believed that they couldn't then act on it later. So I think that is something that's really sticky. In one case, we did see an individual who was coming from an organization that had a pretty strong restriction on cutting, and that person then went back to their home organization with new knowledge that they had gained and really lobbied the home organization to consider changing that policy that they held. So we did observe some boundary spanning where people brought new information back to their home organization and sort of tried to work with the folks that they worked with every day and to change thinking or to bring their organization along to a compromise. I think that's certainly harder in huge organizations, big national organizations that have Washington offices.
But still, that's a pretty great anecdote because it suggests that in the long run, having these CFLR projects makes a difference to the national dialogue.
Yeah, I think it definitely makes a difference to the national dialogue. It will be interesting to follow some of those organizations and see if it seems like any policy, internal policies are changed as a result.
So another question along these lines from Tim asks if part of the problem with adjunct or groups sort of outside the process blocking actions due to their unspoken agendas or of their voices not being fully heard. So I guess it's, if I'm interpreting this right, it's about groups who might not necessarily be in the collaborative process kind of getting in. Did you run into any of those examples?
We observed one instance where an organization was sort of not playing by the rules, so to speak, and then was asked to leave the collaborative. And that organization, I think, is a very strong potential litigant of that collaborative. And so maybe in that case that supports Tim's question. I think that in most of the cases, participation in the collaborative is open. So many of the collaboratives don't have restrictions around who can participate in membership. In the one instance that the group was restricted from participating, they were restricted from participating because they wouldn't sign on to sort of the rules of engagement, like the way that the rules of how people showed up in meetings and talked to each other and how information was shared. And so they certainly could have participated if they had wanted to. In one other collaborative instance that we studied, there was really tight restriction to the executive committee. And so if you were outside of the executive, there was really strict rules about who could participate in the executive committee, and if you weren't a member of that, it might not always be clear because there wasn't regular and transparent communication what the direction of the collaborative would be. And in that case, I do think that feeling like you're left outside the process and the decision-making process certainly could have made people feel like they weren't being represented and the collaborative wasn't doing work that served them well, and that they might potentially oppose any decisions that came out of it.
And that leads into Mindy's question about specific examples of formal structures that are particularly effective. And I don't know if, many of these documents are public. So, Kim, to the extent that maybe you can point me to charters, or without, obviously there's sort of a confidentiality issue here too, or an issue, but maybe offline we can talk a little bit more about how to try to share some of these resources, examples of structures that are particularly useful. And maybe you want to make a general comment.
Share just a little bit. Yeah, I can make a general comment, which is that I think in the cases that did not have a history of adversarial relationship, the structure was less important for smooth running of the collaborative and in the present, and more important for what might happen in the future if the people who had good relationships left. I think the places that the really sort of like clearly delineated and outlined structure mattered was in the examples where people had been working on the landscape together for a long time, but it hadn't been going well, or they had been butting heads for a long time. And in those instances, it was really important that there were rules about who was making decisions, how decisions were getting made. So are we voting? Is it a quorum? Is it a consensus? And that those rules were written down, and that there were really clear rules about participation. So if you're agreeing to participate in this collaborative, you're sort of agreeing to show up with the best of intentions. You're not going to co-opt meetings. You're not going to grandstand during meetings, sort of that level of how we're all going to work together on a daily basis. were really important, and having those written out and shared with everybody so that everybody knew that, okay, I'm going to be showing up with this person that I've fought with for many years, but I see that we're all, agreeing to put in a good faith effort. In the groups where folks had been getting along for a long time, that sort of thing was less important for bringing people to the table.
Great. And I know some people may have to leave. We've reached the top of the hour, but Kim, if it's okay with you, I got a couple more questions I want to be with. Good. So if you need to drop off, feel free to drop off the line as a participant, and I'll follow up with a email with a recording and some other follow-up materials from this. But for those of you who can stay, there's a good question about tribal interaction, and Teresa's pointing out that initially it was her impression that tribal groups were a little bit more hesitant to become involved in CFLRs, and more recently her perception is that there's more engagement, or she's asking if she's seen, if you've seen, Kim, more engagement from tribal partners.
Mm-hmm. So 3 of the 4 that we looked at really closely either had tribal partners or sought to have tribal partners. And I think that certainly in 2 of the groups, the CFLRPs had to do some convincing to get the members of the tribal groups to participate. In one case, that was definitely due to distrusting relationships between that group and the Forest Service, just from historical relationships. One really exciting thing that we've seen come out of one of the CFLRPs is that as a result of sort of building these relationships, and particularly building a relationship between the district and one of the tribal groups, there's now the collaborative is now using the Tribal Forest Protection Act. So what that essentially does is allow members of tribes to do management on Forest Service land if the Forest Service land is adjacent to tribal land and the work on the federal land benefits the tribal land, or the converse, if a lack of work on the federal land would endanger tribal land. So not, for example, not treating federal land would then make the tribal land susceptible to something like catastrophic wildfire or pest invasion or something to that effect. So we have definitely seen, as a spin-off of the CFLRP project, this piece of legislation being used, so that allows the tribes to then actually treat federal land and to bring wood off of the federal land to tribal mills. And so I think that that's really exciting and an interesting sort of spillover of the relationships coming off of the CFLRP.
Neat. So I have a question from a participant here in my office. What recommendation might you have about the forest plan revision process? So thinking about, this other whole set of issues out there, forest plan revisions, and how the influences of functioning, how the forest plan revision process influences the function of an existing CFLRP collaborative. Should it influence existing CFLRs, and I think the other half of this question is, how can we learn from this trust building within CFLRs for forest plan revision?
Yeah, so I have a 2-part answer to that, and it sort of parallels the 2 questions. So the first part of how should it influence, or maybe how does it influence, we did have one of our case studies where not the same ranger district, but the same forest had a CFLRP and a forest plan revision happening, not exactly concurrently, but, like in one started and then another was scheduled to start or started shortly after. And a lot with the same players involved in each. And interestingly, there was not as much spillover in cooperation as we would have imagined. And so I didn't look at this super closely because studying a forest plan revision was outside of the scope of my dissertation, but just very anecdotally talking to people that were involved in both, it was interesting to hear that it might not necessarily there might be a box around the CFLRP, if that makes sense. So the relationships that are built within that might not necessarily spill over and make the forest plan revision go more smoothly. That said, and to the second part of that question about what can be learned from the CFLRP process, I think that the sort of collaborative conversation or getting together and investigating how we want the forest plan to be and what we want the woods to look like as a collection of user groups on the far end of the NEPA process, like before a decision gets made, is applicable in the CFLRP, in a forest plan, anytime that we're talking about doing woods in a national forest setting. So I think a similar organization, right, a similar sort of group of folks acting the same way and having the same types of interactions at the same meetings can certainly happen outside of the CFLRP in a way that might sort of stand in for the typical public hearings that are usually used during a forest plan revision and might be more effective. Now, I think the issue with that is that the CFLRP comes with a lot of money for things like going on field trips and hiring a facilitator or a coordinator if needed. And so it might be tricky, it might be financially difficult to actually pull that off if there's not money associated with it for something like a forest plan revision.
Great.
Does that answer that question
I think,
or get at that question?
Yeah, that's a great response. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your future plans. Neil Chapman was asking if you're planning to sort of expand your study of collaborative forest projects. He mentions, work going on in Minnesota. And I'm curious, you mentioned some future directions, but
yeah. So we're really interested in at this point in looking at that turnover piece, and we will be focusing probably on the first 10 CFLRPs and then potentially a couple others that were involved in the study and were funded in the later rounds of CFLR funding. But I don't think that we will add in at this time any additional new case studies. We're really chatting with the folks that we already have relationships with and the groups that we sort of know the ins and outs of to understand how folks are dealing with turnover and sort of the creative ways that people are protecting the trusting relationships and institutional knowledge that is, built up in these projects. But I don't know if past that project, if we'll expand to other CFLRPs. There are, so Virginia Tech and Florida State are the two sort of home universities for the researchers involved in this project. There are a lot of folks at other universities. There's a whole network of CFLRP researchers, and there's probably 20 to 30 of us across the country. So it wouldn't surprise me if somebody is looking at, if there's not at least one researcher looking at every one of the 23. And I don't know about work specific to Minnesota, but I could sort of put an email out and see if anybody is looking at collaborative groups in that area that's on this network that I'm a part of.
Great. Well, I want to thank you again, Kim, for a great presentation. I think this is a really important topic. I know personally for my 9-to-5 work, it's really this idea of trust is really crucial. So I appreciate you studying it and sharing your research. In the future, next year, whatever, next year after, I'll look forward to learning from you tips and tricks for dealing with personnel transitions. I think looking to that research, so we'll have